I was 19 when this happened. At the time, I worked the afternoon shift at a small diner just outside the city. It was the kind of place where the same customers came in every day, sat in the same booths, and ordered the same meals without even looking at the menu. Most shifts were quiet, predictable. Nothing ever really happened until the day he walked in. It was late afternoon, about 2 hours before my shift was supposed to end. The lunch rush had already passed, and the diner was nearly empty. The door opened, and a tall man walked in. He didn't look unusual. Mid-30s, maybe. Thin, clean clothes, quiet. I greeted him, handed him a menu, and brought him a glass of water. He didn't say anything. He just smiled. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people were awkward, but after a few minutes, I realized something. He hadn't touched the menu. He hadn't touched the water. Every time I walked past, his eyes followed me. I went back over and asked if he was ready to order. That's when he finally spoke. "My name is Anthony." That was it. No order, no question, just his name. I asked again if he wanted anything to eat. He stood up, still smiling, and said, "I'm gonna marry you." Then he walked out. I told my manager about it and we laughed. Customers said weird things all the time, but the next day he came back. Same time, same seat, same smile. He didn't order anything, he just watched me. Every time I turned around, he was looking at me. When my manager told him he needed to order or leave, he stood up and walked toward the door. Before he left, he turned and said, "You're going to be my wife." That was the moment it stopped feeling strange and started feeling wrong. A few days later, he didn't come inside. Instead, he stood outside the front doors, watching. When our eyes met, he smiled, then ran. After that, I started checking the parking lot before every shift. I told my family, and they told me I was probably overreacting. I tried to believe that, until the morning everything escalated. The diner was busy. A few regulars were joking with me at the counter when Anthony walked in again. He sat down and stared like always. One of the regulars made a joke about me being high maintenance, the kind of harmless teasing I heard every day. Anthony slammed both hands down on the counter, hard. The entire diner went silent. He stood up, pointed at me, and started shouting, calling me names. His face was red, his voice shaking. Then he yelled, "I'm gonna kill you," and ran out. I was shaking so badly my manager had to send me to the back. We called the police, but he was gone by the time they arrived. After that, my family started coming to my shifts so I wouldn't be alone. 2 weeks later, a police officer called me. Anthony had been arrested on drug charges. During questioning, he admitted he had been coming to the diner just to watch me. He knew my schedule, he knew when I worked. They told me he wouldn't be out for a long time. I finally felt safe again. Years later, I was still working there part-time while I was in college. One afternoon, the door opened. I looked up, and there he was, Anthony, older, thinner, but the same smile. For a moment, I couldn't move. He walked up slowly and told me he was sorry, said he had been using drugs back then, said he didn't remember most of what he had done. He just wanted to apologize. I told him I forgave him. He nodded and left. I never saw him again. But even now, if someone sits too long without ordering, if someone watches me a little too closely, I notice. Because once someone looks at you like you belong to them, you never forget that feeling. I worked with him for almost 3 years. We weren't close, we didn't talk much outside of work. But we sat near each other, worked on some of the same projects, and saw each other almost every day. He was quiet, a little awkward, but nothing about him ever seemed dangerous, at least not at first. The day everything changed started like any other. I walked into the office and immediately noticed something was wrong. There were police officers everywhere, detectives, people taking photos. A few of my co-workers were standing in small groups, whispering, and then I saw him. He was sitting at his desk, in handcuffs. At first, I assumed it had something to do with work, maybe fraud, maybe something financial. But then one of the detectives asked to speak with me privately. They wanted to know how well I knew him, what he was like, if he had ever made me uncomfortable, if he had ever talked about me. That last question caught me off guard. I told him no, at least I didn't think he had. Over the next few hours, I was called into a conference room multiple times. They asked about my schedule, where I usually parked, whether I ever worked late, whether I'd noticed him watching me. That was the first moment I started to feel uneasy, because once they asked that, I started remembering things, small things, moments where I would look up and he was already looking at me, times when he seemed to leave work at exactly the same time I did, times when he would show up in the break room right after I walked in. At the time, I had never thought much of it. Now it felt different. Near the end of the day, one of the lead detectives asked to speak with me again. This time, his tone was different, more serious. He told me they had searched the man's apartment that morning, and they had found something, journals, dozens of them. For over a year, my coworker had been writing about me every day. What time I arrived, what I wore, who I talked to, when I left, where I parked. He had mapped out my routine completely. The detective told me there were entire sections where he described how much he loved me, how he believed we were meant to be together. But there was a problem. I was married, and according to the journals, that problem had a solution. His plan was detailed, step by step. First, he wanted to make it look like my husband was cheating. He had written about hiring someone to follow him, about sending fake messages, about creating situations that would make me question my marriage. Then, once I was upset and vulnerable, he planned to be there to comfort me, to support me, to make me depend on him. The detective paused at that point, then he told me the last section of the journals described what he would do if none of that worked, if I stayed with my husband, if I rejected him. The detective didn't explain the details. He just said the plan ended with my husband gone, and eventually, me too. I remember feeling like the room got smaller, like everything around me suddenly felt unsafe. For 3 years, I'd worked a few feet away from him. I had sat in meetings with him, walked past him every day, and the entire time, he had been planning a life with me. Whether I wanted it or not, he was charged and held in custody that same day. The detectives told me to be careful for a while, just in case anything changed. For weeks after that, I checked every parking lot before leaving work. I avoided staying late. I looked over my shoulder more than I ever had before. Eventually, the case went to court. He was sentenced, and I was told he would be in prison for a long time. Life slowly went back to normal, at least on the outside. But even now, years later, I still think about it. Because the scariest part wasn't the journals, or the plan, or how detailed everything was. The scariest part was this. For 3 years, I thought he was just the quiet guy who sat across the office. It started with a grocery delivery. At the time, delivery services had become normal in my area, and I used them often. It was convenient, especially on days when I didn't feel like leaving the house. The driver that day seemed familiar. I thanked him, tipped him, and carried the bags inside without thinking much about it. About an hour later, there was another knock at my door. When I looked through the window, it was the same driver. He said he forgot a bag. I checked the kitchen. Everything was there. When I told him that, He hesitated for a moment, like he wasn't sure what to say next. Then he nodded and walked away. Something about the interaction felt strange, but I tried to ignore it. Later that week, my neighbor came over. She had recently installed a ring camera facing the front of the building, and she told me someone had been sitting on my steps the night before for almost 30 minutes. When she showed me the footage, my stomach dropped. It was the delivery driver. I reported it, and they told me he wouldn't be assigned to deliver to me again. But a few weeks later, I saw him again. One afternoon, I heard a delivery being dropped off at my neighbor's door. Out of curiosity, I looked through my peephole. He wasn't at her door. He was standing directly in front of mine, just looking at my windows, looking into my living room. He stood there for several minutes before finally leaving. That was the first time I felt genuinely uncomfortable in my own home. Not long after that, I ordered a few things from Amazon. I heard the packages being dropped off, followed by a knock. I saw the delivery driver walk away and went back to what I was doing. A few minutes later, I heard something else, the sound of my door handle moving, slowly, carefully. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then it happened again, the knob turning, just enough to test whether it was locked. My boyfriend walked over and opened the door, and there he was, the same delivery driver, crouched against the wall, his hand still near the handle. He quickly grabbed one of the packages from the steps, held it out, and said, "Delivery." Then he turned and left. He hadn't delivered anything. The packages had already been there. After that, I stopped ordering deliveries completely. I kept my doors locked at all times. But a few weeks later, something else happened. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed the screen from one of my windows was on the ground. Both screens had been removed. There were smudged handprints all over the glass. Someone had been trying to look inside. I filed another report. Nothing changed. The last incident happened late one night. My boyfriend was coming over after work. When he pulled into the parking lot, he noticed someone moving under my car. At first, he thought it was an animal. Then, the person slid out and tried to hide between the parked cars. It was the delivery driver. The police were called immediately. When they searched the vehicle, they found something taped underneath, an AirTag. He had been tracking my car, tracking where I went, tracking when I left home. He was arrested that night, and I never saw him again. But even now, I don't use delivery services anymore, because the person who brings something to your door already knows exactly where you live.